So these items I have on my workbench at the moment, it's a micro combo system. So for the self-ventilating pot, that means that when I let that dead man go, the pot exhausts. These two items are off that. So we've got the micro valve and the combo valve. Each do a specific job. So what I'm going to do now is just run through the repair of these particular units. So this particular valve here has a wedge in the end of it, as I described earlier, that pinches the hose that seals the pot off and pressurizes the pot. Also too, it has a positive air end with a piston at the end. So how do I identify there's a problem with this particular unit? When I let the dead man go, the wedge doesn't release off the pinch hose and it won't exhaust. Ultimately, this particular gauze vent that's here, if that's blocked or has excessive dust around it, it can't vent. So without this cylinder here exhausting, that wedge will remain in place, jammed in place primarily because the air that came in can't escape or get out. So before you start pulling this valve apart, I strongly suggest that you take this gauze filter off and just check to see if it's clear and clean. Blow it out, put it back on the pot, and that way you can establish what it is point by point that's causing this to fail or not actuate correctly. So give it a wash. You can give it a wash in solvent or warm soapy water, blow it out both sides. Now the important thing to remember is it's trying to exhaust this way, so therefore the rubbish is going to be in the back of it. If there isn't any contaminants in there, they'll be inside there. So turn it back this way and blow it out this way. So you're blowing it backwards, and then you can ascertain whether there is remnants of contaminants within that little chamber there. Once you blow it out and you can breathe through it, like so, replace it back into the body of the combo valve. And there's no need to over tighten that because it's only brass. So if you over tighten it, you could strip it, strip the thread that is. So just nip it up like so. No need to swing off it and over tighten it. So say for example that's still on the pot and you actuate the dead man again and the piston's not moving, ultimately you'll have to dismantle this particular unit to ascertain as to why there's no actuation there. So as you can see, there's 4 casing bolts here. So the bolts hold this outer body to this body here. So what I suggest you do if you've never pulled one apart before, ultimately you need to mark each area, which has been done here. They don't align at the moment because the bolts are loose, but if I loosen those bolts off, all these marks here would line up. So before you start pulling the unit apart, just mark where you are. So you can put a cross there if you wish to, a mark on there to identify which one goes which side, because this has to be in a specific spot. And also too, if you look here where the dead man return line is and the dead man active line, they are important. It's important that they line up as well. So everything's corresponding. Those two correspond with each other. And the exhaust port is actually on the bottom of the valve itself. So where your air came in, it comes in through here, goes out through the front here, back into your pot. So entry, exit. And so that means that this side here is positive air. So to ascertain what is going on with this particular unit, it's best to dismantle it. I suggest you use the appropriate tools to do the job, primarily because if you don't have the right tools, it can make it very awkward. Now in saying that, you'll find that if you're trying to undo things like this with a shifter, it's slow, awkward, and you run the risk of rounding off the nuts because you can't get them in to the moulded areas of the valve itself. It's a little bit difficult, tedious, and quite slow. You'll find also too that some of these new ratchet spanners won't fit into the body, so ultimately you have to go back to the open end section of it. There's nothing wrong with using a shifter to hold the bolt for you and then undoing the bolt with the open ender. So just keep turning the unit around and loosen the bolts so that they are just finger tight. And it's important to blow these down and give them a bit of a wash before you start this. So continue to undo your bolts And just keep rotating the unit to undo the bolts. Now just to reiterate on the marking of this, just to ensure that I've got it in the right place, I can put 2 marks on here, 1 on there, so that I know when I reassemble this where I am in conjunction to what should go where. There's no need to mark the bolts, of course, but certainly the body of the unit and the cylinder in the center here needs to be put back in the same place. So now that these are only finger tight, I can continue to do this. You can do this with gloves on. Keep all of it together so that you've got all the washers and nuts so that you don't get lost in relation to its reassembly. And occasionally you'll get one that's a little bit tight on the thread. Again, use your shifter to undo that, like so. And if they remain to be tight, of course, there's always one, and you'll have to wind it all the way off with the appropriate tool. So let that one go. Now go back to the diagonal opposing of that, which is this one. And you'll find that there is a little bit of tension on these nuts, primarily because we're now undoing a spring inside this particular unit. So the spring is holding the tension on the bolts as we separate them. So now that those 2 opposing are still there, we'll remove this one here, and there's the tension on the spring holding that bolt in place. So undo the nuts, see how much easier it is with the appropriate spanner, and of course keep them all together so you don't lose where you are with the reassembly. Okay, so now you can see here, look, that one's tight, and so is this one, because that spring is now starting to expand. So for the last 2 bolts, you'll find you'll undo one completely and take it out of the carriage, like so. And it helps if you just push it, hold it together to get those last ones undone. So remember what I said, keep the washers because you need to reinstate them. Now you see it's trying to separate itself. So for this last one, just put it on the bench, push it down and see if you can undo that nut. If you can't do it, don't panic. Just go revert back to the original undoing them by spanner to remove them. Now you can see this is trying to separate itself now, so that's the recoil on the spring tension. So just be patient and undo them while holding the head of the bolt. There you go. So if you've got a clean work area and you do manage to drop items, which I'm very good at, you'll be able to recover them and see where they are. So if you're on site, I'd suggest you put a drop sheet down, some cladding, whatever, just so you've got a clean work area. So remove the bolts and sit them in an area so that you know where they are. So to give you an indication of what happens here is, remember the marks we put on there? So the marks there now tell us where we have to line them up. So remove this end, which is the pressure end, and as you can see here, the cylinder comes out, there's the wedge, and this here actually retains the pressure in the end of that where the pressure comes in. So what that does is that allows the air to travel through the pot, as well as this here coming backwards through here, pinching the hose in this particular environment here. So in the end of this valve, the hose is pinched with that wedge. So just put them to one side. Is there any wear factors in this? The only thing you'll find that wears in there is if you leave the hose that I mentioned has to be checked for its integrity, the wall integrity of the hose that's poked through here. So you can imagine here's the hose through here and the wedge is coming in and pinching the hose every time you operate the dead man. So it's a good idea to start, when you start blasting, try not to trigger the dead man on and off, because this wedge is pinching that hose all the time. So if the hose is undermined and left and the wall of the hose is damaged, it'll tend to blow a hole in this casing. So then what we're inspecting this casing for is the pinch bar to see that it is concentric. Also too, this body to ensure that none of the body's been undermined by abrasive if that hose was broken and left unattended. So that's fine, we're happy with that. What are we looking for in here? Well, this rubber seat actually seals all that pressure in the bottom here on a seat. So it's important that we look at this seat to ensure that it's still got a nice taper, there's no big gouges or scratches, and the rubber has a chance to seal on that seat and hold that air pressure in there. There's nothing else you have to worry about here except for a big scour mark or any damage. So what I suggest you do is put that face up, because if you put it face down and it's on a rock or something, you could scratch that. So it wouldn't pay to damage that face edge of this particular end unit. So put that to one side, we're happy with that. Now, here's the trick. This is the cylinder that harnesses a lot of air, and all this does is go back and forth like this every time you actuate the dead man. Back and forth, that's all it does. Now, make note of this particular one here when you pull it out. And the reason I say that is because you can be caught unawares in relation to the reassembly of this. And I'll show you as I dismantle it. So you need to take this rubber off. This rubber seat needs to come off, and it should be 7/16. Like so. Anyone think I've done this before? 7/16. So you'll find that because that's a nylock nut, you'll need to hang on to the wedge, and away you go. Now, as you undo this, take note, because there's a couple of things here you need to reinstate. Now, there you are. There's a copper washer. So just slide that off. And look what's underneath this plunger head. There's a copper washer, and underneath that copper washer is another one of these O-rings, and there's another copper washer. So in essence, what I'm saying to you is that this here has got a copper washer in behind it. So if I just grab the screwdriver and pop that out so you can see what I'm talking about, there it is. There's the O-ring, there's the copper washer. So if you put a kit in this, what you'll find is you'll get an O-ring, copper washer, O-ring, copper washer. So ensure that you put them back in that order, because the O-rings seal that particular rubber, both sides. So it's imperative that it is sealed. So put them to one side. Remember what I said, if it's second hand, put it to one side so you don't get it mixed up with the new stuff. So there's the second hand part. Now this shaft here, we have to inspect this shaft for damage. So if there's any scouring or sacrificial damage to this shaft, it can be rendered null and void, primarily because it has to seal on the inside of this particular backing plate. Now you'll see now why I've marked that backing plate, because look, the backing plate comes out like so. There's an O-ring behind it, but what can happen is this whole unit can go back together with this in around this way, and the consequence of that is that when you actuate it, there's not enough travel distance for this piston to pinch your hose off. So that is stopping the travel distance of the hose, of the crimp edge for the hose, I should say. So this actually goes around that way. Now you can see why I've marked it. But also too, look at this faceplate. There's a step in it to accommodate the O-ring. So the O-ring seals this particular unit so that air doesn't escape around its circumference. Also in this particular unit, when you're putting a kit in there, you'll see there's a bronze bush. On the other side of that, you'll find that there's a recess or a ringland. So what is in there is another O-ring. So the O-rings that are here, there's always also an O-ring in that recess. And that's designed to seal that piston as the piston travels through. So when we reassemble this, we don't use grease, anti-seize, any wet lubricants whatsoever. We use a product called graphite dust. So graphite dust is not a product that accumulates. If it gets moisture on it, it tends to coagulate slightly, but it still remains as a lubricant, same as graphite grease. So graphite dust is the only item I use to reassemble these, primarily because it's a good dry lubricant, and if there is moisture in there, it doesn't coagulate to the situation where it impedes the actuation of this particular unit. If you use grease and it gets dust in there, the dust becomes aggressive and abrades the stem of the piston and any other rubbers that are in this particular unit. So set that to one side. Now this particular item here is the piston itself. So this piston runs in this barrel. So, oh, it doesn't fit. Oh no, that's right, it went that way. So you've got to be conscious of how you pull this apart as to how it goes back together. But remember, if you mark these items, it's easy to establish which one went where. Oh no, that doesn't go there, it hasn't got 2 marks. This one goes here, it's got 2 marks. Slide the piston out, and you'll see that the piston has an O-ring on it. So this O-ring is actually a sergeant seal, and it's designed in such a manner that the sergeant seal has 2 lips. So if you think to yourself, okay, I took the seal off, gee, which way did it go? It's easy to remember that when you put a sergeant seal or a chevron seal back in, the 2 lips face the pressure. So where would the pressure be in this chamber? Well, if we go back to this again, you'll find that that was where the return line was for the dead man. So the return line, when you actuate the dead man, fills this chamber and pushes this backwards. So the chevron seal always faces the pressure. So remember, it goes this way, so that way that chevron seal must face towards the spring. If you're worried about it as you flip it off, just take a photo in case you forget. So this recess in this particular piston has to be wiped clean and the new seal doused again with graphite dust. And in here, when you put them back on, don't use spanners, screwdrivers. Just stretch the O-ring and slide it back over the surface so that it pops back into place. If it rolls on you, just bring it together like this, pop it up and slide it backwards, back over that recess so that you can re-establish its correct installation. So you see, it's relatively easy to do it by hand. Because it is a rubber composition, it will stretch but go back into place quite easily. Is there anything I need to do else here? Not really, no. Just make sure it's clear and clean and there's no contaminants left in there. The one thing I am looking for though is in this particular cylinder where that O-ring runs, I'm looking for any sacrificial damage. What could be the sacrificial damage? Well, ultimately, if there's garnet enters into this area, so for example, I took that little breather out because it was blocked and didn't replace it, garnet can end up in this particular cylinder. So if garnet and air are travelling back and forth on there, it's abrasive. So the abrasion will actually put scours, and they'll be vertical scours in this cylinder. If you're on site and you don't have another cylinder, what I suggest you do is get some 600 wet and dry, some kerosene or any type of wet lubricant, even oil, a light oil, and you can't rub the marks out like this. You actually have to do it in a circular motion just to take the edge off those scours. You can reassemble it, but you know eventually you have to replace this cylinder if there's scour marks in there. It works exactly the same as the bore in the engine of your car. If there's scours in there, it has to be either rebored, which in this case we don't bother because there's not a tolerance there to accommodate a bigger O-ring. So if it's scoured, you replace it. But to get you out of trouble, if you take the sharp edges off the scouring, that's ultimately enough to get you started and back up and running. So don't forget, on the other side of this is your O-ring. So align your marks. You're going to fight the spring. So the spring that we had it being behind the piston is going to be the thing you're trying to fight. So ultimately, look, just get your bolts started in there and you'll find that once you get them started, it'll come together and just squash up. Just ensure that it's all in place in situ. So what you need to do is just, look, we've got one in this corner. Go back to this diagonal section here and we put a bolt in. So if you do it diagonally, you've got a better chance of getting the thing started. So put your washer on, start your nuts. So these nuts aren't nylock nuts, so they do need the washer on there to ensure that you have got the things done up nice and tight. So just push it towards yourself, slide the bolt in, put the washer on, and it'll come together relatively quickly. So just keep going around the unit and putting your bolts back in. Does it matter which way they go? Look, to be quite honest with you, if you just make sure you've got all the nuts on one end, all the heads of the bolts on the other end, at least that way it's got some sort of series and format that you put it back together and it doesn't look like some amateurs had a go at it. So there you go. Look, there's no need to try and do them up nice and tight. Got the other bolt in, this one here. Which way is it? It's all good. Around like that. So now, just as I mentioned, don't forget your washers, like so. Start the nut on the thread. So now you can see what's important to keep the threads clean, make sure they're not damaged. So when you're trying to start the bolts on there, they'll start for you. So let's have a look here, let's check to make sure, because you can make mistakes with reassembly as well. Let's see, bolt, nut, oh, nut. So don't panic, look. Take the tension up on the spring and look at that, how easy it is for reassembly. So as I say, it's important to make it look like you know what you're doing. So by all means, change them around to make them look uniform and neat, and they all correspond with each other. And look again, you see, so if you're not watching what you're doing, the problem can quickly arise that you've got one bolt round a different way to the other. No dramas. Just grab your shifter, undo that one because it's got a little bit of spring tension on it, and turn him around. So if you don't take notice of how you pull it to pieces, as you can see, without marking your steps and knowing where you're going, you can very quickly get lost. Now look here, that's moved. So let's go back to our corresponding marks. Oh, look at that. There they are, 1, 2. I need to take a little bit of tension up on that. So I'll ultimately just wind these bolts up by keeping them with the shifter, like so, and tighten them all up slowly and methodically. Now, I can't do this one all the way up tight because it may pinch the piston crooked in the housing. So this one, the opposing diagonal side, which is this one, go back to this one and start doing this one up. So just get your shifter on the nut and do it up. So what we're doing is we're pulling it together, but we're doing it in such a way that it's diagonal and you can't pinch the body going into the piston housing. So go back again to that one. So by doing it diagonally, you're pulling the thing up square without damaging the housing. So back and forth, slow wins the race and you won't make any mistakes. So that's enough. See, I've still got a gap there. Back to the diagonal side. Again, put your shifter on there and then just continue to tighten it up. Shifter needs adjusting, like so. It's much easier with ring spanners, or you can use a socket if you wish to on this. But 9 times out of 10 on site, sockets are a scarce commodity. So I've done it this way just to show you that on site you can achieve a positive outcome just by using the bare basic essentials in relation to reassembly. So look at that, I've pulled that up nice and tight now, one and the diagonally opposing one, and you can see now, even with this one loose and this one loose, that they've come home. Do my marks line up? Absolutely. So these line up as well. Where's the vent? He's on the bottom, ready to rock and roll. So it's all good. So make sure you tighten these up, and then what you'll do is you'll go around the bolts diagonally again, not one by one, so I won't tighten that one, tighten that one, tighten that one. You'll do them diagonally so that you've got the appropriate pull and torque on these bolts. So how tight would I do these bolts up? All you need to do is make sure they are tight. There's no need to over torque them or tension them up too much, because all you're doing is creating yourself a nightmare if you wish to remove these bolts in the future. So that one's coming up tight. this one here, bring him up tight. So you see how quickly they tightened up. Now go back to the opposing diagonal side, which is this one. Tighten it up. Yes. The other one. Yes. The other one. And so on. Now you see I haven't over tightened them, and it's relatively easy to make sure that I have got them right. So back to the other corner of this one, and so on. So I think you basically get the understanding of what I'm trying to achieve here. So have I got them all tight? Do the last one, just make sure they are tight. Which way do I go? Righty tighty, lefty loosey. So, did they move? Yes, they did. So if you're concerned and think, oh, did I miss any? Just repeat those steps. Go back through the whole thing again. So this side, of course, diagonal opposing side. Now, what I suggest, if this is holding the bolt, go back to the head of the bolt, like so, and use this to torque it up, and you've got more chance of feeling what the resistance is on that nut. So now we're starting to get there, and because we're nearly tight, we can go the next one now, because all we're doing is nipping them up, so the tension and the torque is already on all the marrying surfaces. So yep, nice and tight. So by checking it, you're keeping yourself safe and anybody else that intends to use this unit in the future. So there you go. That's a combo valve repair in its entirety. One other thing I'll check is the thread clear and clean? Yes, it is. Is the piston in the right place? Yes. Is the wedge around the right way? Yes. Is it all nice and clean? Yes. Vents reinstated. So when I put it back on the machine now, I'll screw it back on the machine with a bit of thread tape here, a bit of thread tape on this one, on the male side of that, and also too, I'll slide the hose back in there and put the clamp on the bottom to stop the hose flapping around when you exhaust the pot. So that's a combo valve disassembly, repair and reinstatement of all the components.